In this lesson, we'll create multiple setup sheets. After completing this lesson, you'll be able to create a setup sheet for a single setup, create a setup sheet for multiple WCS setups. In Fusion 360, we want to carry on with our completing a multi-axis setup. At this point, we should have two NC programs inside of our browser. And remember that our SoftJaw Setup 1 is using multiple WCS. If we want to make any changes to that, we can right-click and edit, and note that we're using G54 as our first offset, and it's incrementing it 3 times. This is going to be important when we create our setup sheets to make sure that we understand what information is going into it. What I want to do is take a look at creating a setup sheet and what some of the options that we have are. I do want to note that currently some of this functionality is different between PC and Mac users. That functionality is changing and evolving all the time, but some of the things that we're going to cover are going to be exclusive to PC users, and Mac users will not have some of the same options. So right now, I want to talk about creating a setup sheet, but before we get into that, I think it's important to note in our preferences that we do have some preview functionality options that we can talk about. Inside of here, we want to take a look at the manufacturer workspace and preview functionality. If we scroll down inside of our preview functionality, this changes from time to time, but note that we have post-process with NC program. This is something that replaces the dialog box with the NC program dialog when post-processing operations. So this is important because we've already talked about using post-process, and we've used NC program, and we've talked about the differences between them. I think it's a good idea for you to select Learn More and understand what changes are coming as they relate to NC programs and post-processing. Another thing I want to note is that there's something called Setup Sheet Configurations. We generally don't take a look at preview functionality, but this is something also that's coming, and it's going to help us customize what we see on setup sheets, and hopefully will bring some better information to the Mac users for configuring those setup sheets. So at this point, we know that there's some preview functionality that's going to be changing the way in which we interact with setup sheets and post-processing. From here to post-process, we can go to post-process or create an NC program. We already know all of that information. To create a setup sheet, we can do very similar actions. We go to our Actions section and select Setup Sheet, which will create an HTML document. If we go to our Setup dropdown, we don't have setup sheets in here, but what we will note is that we can right-click on the setup inside of our browser, and we can create a setup sheet from here by selecting Setup Sheet. And again, we've already noted that inside of our NC Programs folder, we can right-click and we can create that setup sheet as well. All of these will take you to the same HTML document creation. So now that we know where we can find it, let's take a look at what happens when we click on it. I'm going to expand my SoftJaw Setup 2 and use this as my first example. I want to note that when we have a setup, it's important to make sure that what we see on the screen is representative of what we're trying to machine. So right now you can see we've got a lot of extra bodies on the screen, so we want to come into our SoftJaw fixture, and I want to take a look at what's being displayed. I don't need to worry about the rear SoftJaw or the front and rear jaws. Those are not needed for this image. So once we have just the part selected, it's showing our stock, it's showing the coordinate system location, then I want to right-click and I want to create that setup sheet. We need to determine a folder location. If you want to place it in a specific location, make sure you select that, and then it'll open up in whatever web browser you're using. Note that the image that we see in the setup section is showing the image we had on the screen in Fusion. It shows the stock, it shows the coordinate system location, and it shows our part. If you don't have that setup selected, it won't show the stock body and it won't show that WCS location. I feel like this is critical to make sure that we understand where it's located in reference to our part. It gives you information about what WCS offset's being used. It tells you the stock size. It tells you information about the location of the WCS. And then we get into information about the program in general. Number of operations, the tools used, information about the max feed rate and spindle speed, and information about the estimated cycle time, in this case about 11 minutes. Then we get a tool list, and then we have an operations list. When we look at this, it's important to note that we're looking at a cross-section of the tool and the holder. This is important information because in some cases that holder information, especially in multi-axis parts, is going to be a lot more critical. And it needs to make sure that the holder represented in the program is also represented on the physical machine. So what happens if we create a setup sheet from a setup that has multiple WCS coordinates? So in this case, SoftDraw Setup 1 is going to be the bottom of our part. So I'm going to rotate this around, again making sure that we can see the stock, we can see the coordinate system location. And once I have done that, I'm going to go to Actions and select Setup Sheet. Again, select the folder we want to place it in. And once again, the image that we saw on the screen in Fusion is what we see here. This is telling us that we're using WCS offsets 1, 2, and 3. And it also has a program uses multiple WCS offsets exclamation point. So this is telling me that the user, the operator, needs to set WCS 1, 2, and 3 references, which in the case of a Haas machine is G54, 55, and 56. We also note that there are 9 operations. It shows the tool, it shows the operations, but these are all referencing a single program. When I say a single program, we're cutting a single part. We're just doing it in 3 separate instances on the machine. What happens if we select 2 setups and we try to create a setup sheet? Once again, we need to select the folder. We get prompted with that multiple setups with different WCSs. When we do this, you see that the preview on the screen, it's not showing us both of those setups. It's only showing the one that we were displaying on the screen. It tells us that we're using multiple WCS. And as we go down the line, it tells us that we now have 12 operations. And if we look at the information for the operations, it tells us information about the WCS used, but it's assuming that all of these operations are happening in sort of the same program. You'll notice that here, there's a new WCS that's shown every time it's changing. You can see that we have 1, 2, 3, new WCS as it's shown, but this is not a great way to display information for multiple setups. So when we create these setup sheets, we need to be mindful of what's selected, especially if we're using the reference of an NC program. If we take a look at the NC program, SoftDraw with no probe, and we create a setup sheet for this, we'll have to, again, determine where we want to publish it. And you'll note that there's a difference here. Right now, what we're doing is we're selecting a folder that's inside of our data panel on the cloud. So in this case, I'm going to be taking a look at lesson 11 or 12. I'm going to save that, and then it's going to save that setup sheet, and now it's displayed in a different manner. So when we do this based off of the NC program, we're getting a different result that's more configurable. What this means is that we can take a look at the tools only, we can take a look at a compact, we can take a look at a summary image only, we can look at the tools only, or compact no operation tool images. So when we scroll down, it gives us the operations, but it doesn't have that tool image with it. So this is a great option because one, this is saved in the data panel with the design itself. You also can configure it and then you can print it out. So this gives us additional configurations for those setup sheets that we didn't have before when just using the standard setup sheet option. When you're a PC user, I do want to show one more option that you guys have when you're creating these setup sheets. To do this, I'm going to go back and I'm going to select SoftDraw Setup 2. It doesn't really matter which one we select, but we want to go to post-process. This is a little bit different because instead of post-processing to Haas pre-NGC, what we want to do now is take a look at our all dropdown and we're going to select Setup Sheet. When we select Setup Sheet, what we can do here is we can configure what that setup sheet will contain. The default setup sheet is this HTML. This is what we get when we click that Setup Sheet button. However, we also have HTML, CSV versions of just the operation sheet. We have them of the tool list. And these are different configurations that we see in that dropdown when we're talking about using the NC program. So in my case, I'm going to do an HTML tool sheet. I'm going to post this, select my folder, and then I get the code that's referencing this HTML tool sheet. So you'll notice that this code is creating this sort of post-processor type code that we would typically see when we're post-processing. Now, that's not universally true for all of these options, but there are some of these post-process setup sheet options that do contain different outputs. So when we use these different outputs and we select it from the post-process dialog box, oftentimes you're going to get a different result. But it does give you additional options that you can explore when you're creating those setup sheets. My recommendation from this point forward is that everybody creates these NC programs, and we post-process those NC programs and create setup sheets from them. This is going to be extremely helpful in the way that you can custom tailor and configure the programs that you're creating by selecting operations, gathering the information, and displaying it quite easily on the screen whenever we come in and we edit these post-processors. We can see the work offset, we can see the tool used, we can see information about the operations, and we can configure what we're taking a look at when we're posting. So in this case, I just want to make sure that any changes made are saved and that we understand the variations that we have when we're creating these setup sheets and what the most efficient options are for you. At this point, once you've saved your file, make sure that you move on to the next step.